Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 29th, 1970, a Senate vote falls 6 votes shy. Okay, Senate votes fall shy all the time, so what were they voting on? They were voting on an amendment to the Constitution that would have scrapped, effectively, the Electoral College and replaced it with a much simpler system based on the popular vote. No more 538 electoral votes, a huge change in the structure of our democracy. More importantly, a real sliding doors moment for Nate Silver. No more 538, no more me. I don't know where I would have worked from 2015 to 2019. It's always about me. And who knows what Steve Kornacki's job would look like without all of that electoral math. He is our guest for this episode. Hello, Steve Kornacki, national political correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. Thank you for joining us. We've been trying to get you on the show for a while, so I'm really glad you could do it.
I had never quite thought of it the way you were just describing it there. But yeah, the implications for what we do without the state-based system, I'm shuddering a little.
What would your map look like? Well, look, Steve, this is an old journalistic trick. Is whenever you encounter an interesting story, the first question to ask is, "What would this mean for me?" Right. You know, and then you work up from there. And as always, with us is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody. I think you would have had to have called it something like the 330 million instead of 538.
Exactly. It's a harder URL to type
More
in.
unwieldy.
Yeah. So, Steve, I mean, one thing, we've learned on this show, and it's important to think about in history, is, context is everything. And fights that may seem like principled fights are not principled fights. They're often about the particular context. And it seems to me like you don't understand this moment where the Electoral College almost gets scrapped without really understanding what happened in the 1968 presidential election. So you kind of want to lay that groundwork for us?
Sure. Yeah. In 68, I think it's no coincidence that in the aftermath of 68, they came the closest they've come to getting rid of the Electoral College, because I think both parties could look at what happened in 68 and see an incentive for changing things. Because the unique wrinkle in 68 was you had a candidate, George Wallace, who had been a Democrat, ran as an independent, was conservative, was a segregationist, who ran with the expressed intent of throwing the election to the House of Representatives, basically gobbling up enough states in the South that nobody could get to 270 electoral votes. And then, as we always talk about, one of those scenarios, if you get a tie or if nobody gets to 270, is the election goes to the House of Representatives. Each state delegation gets 1 vote. And Wallace and his backers, his basically Southern backers, believed this would be the maximum, leverage opportunity for them. So that was his goal, and he won. He ended up winning, 5 Southern states. Nixon got elected. Nixon got to 301 electoral votes. The popular vote was very close too. Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, came within, I think, about 500,000 votes of actually beating Nixon, for the popular vote. But I think both Nixon coming out of that and Humphrey and the Democrats coming out of that realized that the scenario where they're both kind of held up by George Wallace, this very polarizing, force in American politics. I think both of them could come out of that seeing an incentive. And in fact, that was really 68 was the second time in 20 years that something like that almost happened. Because in 48, it had been Strom Thurmond, and Strom Thurmond, again, had been a Democrat, conservative Democrat, segregationist, formed the Dixiecrats, and again thought in the 48 election he could win enough southern states, to throw it to the House. And I think Truman, who won the 48 election, I think his electoral number was almost identical to Nixon's. He won, I think it was 303 or something like that. But basically in 48 and again in 68, almost the same thing happened. So I think it was one of those moments when both parties could kind of walk away from the election and say, maybe we should rethink this thing.
Yeah, it was a really popular idea within the conservative movement to try to get a conservative president by throwing the presidential election into the Electoral College. And it seems like this crazy idea. When I was in the archives reading about this, I was like, that seems like a stretch. But in the context of this period between 48 and 68, right, it had kind of been a live issue.
Yeah. So you end up with this amendment. And I mean, one thing to point out is that there's always a legislative path that involves tweaking and fiddling around the edges of a system, especially a system as complicated as this. But instead, what ends up happening is something that would just basically completely scrap it and turn to what I've heard as described as a kind of more French-style voting, which is basically straight up popular vote. And then if neither of the winners gets 40%, which I guess would mean if there's a very split vote, then it goes to a second round. But basically, popular vote, winner takes all. So, Niki, do you have a sense of why they went with the let's scrap the whole thing as opposed to let's fiddle around the edges?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the person behind the amendment, which was Indiana Senator Birch Bayh. So Birch Bayh in 1963 had become the head of this arcane, almost scrapped subcommittee in the Judiciary Committee that was focused on constitutional amendments. And it was a really auspicious time for him to be there because one of the very first things he's handed is coming up with an amendment to clear up the line of succession, which became a live issue after JFK was assassinated. But, he had been paying attention to what was happening in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court at the time had made a bunch of rulings that introduced and underscored this principle of one person, one vote. It was kind of a radical, democratizing idea that the Supreme Court had promoted. And Birch Bayh was like, if we're doing this one person, one vote thing, we kind of have to get rid of the Electoral College because the Electoral College doesn't make any sense if our foundational principle is one person, one vote, everybody gets equal apportionment. And so he had already been thinking about this kind of amendment to scrap the Electoral College entirely when the 1968 election happens, and he sort of seizes on the moment.
I think the other, ingredient, I think Niki's getting at it there, was the conservative movement saw an opportunity, but that wasn't yet analogous with the Republican Party. And so you had a lot of Republican buy-in. I think Howard Baker was one of the, who ended up becoming later on the Senate Republican leader, was an advocate for the popular vote. So you had sort of institutional Republican Party folks who were not interested in having anything to do with an alliance with George Wallace that could, proceed to get a Barry Goldwater style president put in place. So it really was a different time in American politics. I think is the thing to appreciate, where the parties just weren't defined the way they are now demographically and culturally.
And I think we can, we hear today one person, one vote, and that sounds like a no-brainer. But for conservatives and conservatives in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, this was a real threat. I mean, the response to this in 1964 was we're a republic, not a democracy. Like the idea of one person, one vote is actually anti-American in the conservative view at this time. So there is a real fight, but it's a fight that's not defined by party lines, but by this ideology.
Right. So let's talk about how that has kind of evolved over time and in the decades since. I mean, there's a ton to tease out here. I mean, I will say one thing that I just am curious about, Steve, is, have fights over the Electoral College tended to become more polarized over the decades, or have they always sort of, because right now it feels like a proxy fight for, in this moment, Democrats and Republicans. Has it always been that way, or has it sometimes been not along those lines?
The thing I think that's been missing, I'll put it this way, in the last half century or so, is that ingredient we're talking about following 68, where both parties, broadly speaking, felt incentivized to change it. Because you've had some occurrences since 68. Start with 76, where in 76, Jimmy Carter wins the presidency, popular vote-wise, a fairly comfortable margin, but Electoral College-wise, by the skin of his teeth. Just change a few votes in Ohio and Hawaii, and Gerald Ford becomes the president despite losing the popular vote by, I think 1.7 million, something like that. So Carter made a push for it, but there wasn't that moment. There was some Republican buy-in for it, but that was the push, I think, afterward that had the best chance. Since, modern times, I think, look, in 2000, Gore wins the popular vote, Bush wins the Electoral College. There was certainly energy from Democrats. There was clearly no energy from Republicans after that. But the thing I've always wondered about is, and it's forgotten because it didn't actually come to pass, but in 2004, Bush gets reelected by 2.5 million votes nationally. But if you switched 59,000 in Ohio, and John Kerry has said this, through the years, John Kerry lost to Bush in 2004. He said, if you took half of the stadium for an Ohio State football game and switched their votes, I'm president of the United States. So, you could have had a situation where in 2000, Bush is president because of the Electoral College, and the Republicans are cheering and the Democrats are furious. In 2004, the exact opposite happens. And I've always wondered, if that had happened, would you then have maybe had the momentum and the buy-in from both parties to say, okay, let's set a date in the future. We don't know who's going to be president in 2016 and change it for something like that. But we've never had the occurrence, I think, again, where both parties felt there was something in it.
Well, and I suppose it's, as both of you have written about and explored so well, like we're living in such a polarized moment where it is impossible for one side to make an argument that doesn't seem self-interested, right? Even if they're making it on principles, it's going to come off that way and it's just going to fall along those lines. And so I think, I'm sort of stating the obvious here, but again, every political argument is impacted by the levels of polarization that have grown in the decades since the period we're talking about here.
And that's what's so great about Steve's counterfactual, which is that it would have blurred or demolished those kind of partisan polarized lines because both parties would have lost something significant. And I think you're right that is probably what would have been necessary for this to happen.
And Steve, generally speaking, I mean, I know 2 out of the last 5 elections, the popular vote winner has not ended up becoming president, but generally speaking, the popular vote and the electoral vote have tended to scan. But is it the case that is changing more and more?
I think just the demographic realities of the Trump era, for however long that lasts, are making it, very possible. I think there's a wide sense out there that if Trump gets reelected in 2020, it will be despite losing the popular vote and only by winning the Electoral College. It's a president whose approval rating in a polling average has never hit 50%, who didn't win the popular vote to start with, and who has consistently trailed by a fairly significant margin in every national poll. So the formula for Trump really seems to be find the right combination of states, as he did in 2016, to get to 270. So, but I think that we lose sight of, and I think you're getting at something important there, we lose sight of the broader sort of sweep of things. And I try to remind people of this all the time, and that is history didn't begin in 2016. We say in 2016, oh my God, for the second time in 16 years, the Democrats have won the popular vote and lost the presidency. As I said, in 2004, nearly the exact opposite happened. And it would have been, if Kerry had pulled that off in 2004, the scale of it would have been a lot bigger. In 2000, Bush lost the popular vote by about 600,000. Kerry would have lost it by 2.5 million and almost became president. And then I can remember 2012. I know it seems like an eternity ago, but the conventional wisdom in 2012, you can go find A1 articles from the Washington Post a week before the election in 2012 saying Mitt Romney's got the advantage nationally. Mitt Romney could win the popular vote in this race, but you know what's going to save Obama? Remember this term? The blue wall. The blue wall states, the Electoral College lock that the Democrats have built since 92. I mean, that was conventional wisdom, just before Trump. So this stuff can change and can feel like it's solidified, I think, a lot more than it actually has.
Wait, and isn't there a quickly deleted Trump tweet from election night 2012 in which he thought that this exact thing was going to happen, that Romney was going to win the popular vote, but Obama was still going to become president, and he rails against the Electoral College, quickly takes down the tweet. Of course, 4 years later, he famously says, I didn't know much about the Electoral College until this year, but now I think I'm coming around to it. But yes, it does always break down in that way.
Yeah, it's fascinating the way that conventional wisdom on things like this, back in most of the 2000s and 2010s, there was this argument that demography was destiny for the Democrats, that just like the way that demographics looked in the United States was going to build this enduring majority for the Democrats. And that conventional wisdom as it is has just been shattered. And so I think that's a really great reminder of how quickly conventional wisdom gets formed and how quickly it gets forgotten.
So we'll start to wrap up here, but I kind of want to, as I see it, Steve, there's sort of two arguments against the Electoral College, or that paint the Electoral College as not democratic. I mean, one is that it favors some states and some kinds of voters over others, and that, a voter in Ohio has 10 times more effect on the election than a voter in Vermont or whatever. The other is that it can lead to these splits between the popular vote and who ends up winning. And I'm wondering whether you can kind of track those two, and whether one feels like it's being argued more, and which one maybe is going to be the more compelling argument if there's actually is another real conversation about the Electoral College.
I've always thought that the simplest one is just the idea. The
split.
Growing up in the 90s and being into politics then, I remember just going back and looking at old election results, seeing 68, seeing 76, going back to the 19th century, the last time at that point you had one of these popular vote Electoral College splits. And I remember just wondering to myself, what would happen? If it ever happened. And I remember the two things I remember are, one, when I would talk to experts in the 90s, my college professors and stuff, it was very dismissive. It was, that'll never happen. There was just a sense that we had kind of somehow, I don't know how, outgrown it. But second of all, I had the sense that it would be, there'd be people in the streets, and that it would be, this can't, and I just, the thing about it, so it finally happens in 2000, and the thing I didn't anticipate, and why I feel it was never fully tested, is that in 2000, the popular vote was an afterthought, because the drama in Florida just took center stage and overwhelmed everything. And, Gore is called the winner, then Bush is called the winner, then it's called back, then it goes to court. And are we going to count these ballots? And are we going to count those ballots? And that was the story for 40 days.
Right.
And it was just sort of like, by the way, 58 minutes into this newscast, we'll mention Gore won the popular. So I feel in some ways like the thing I expected sort of as a hypothesis to happen never really got tested because we didn't focus on it. And so I've kind of always wondered too, if 2000 had been a little cleaner, Bush gets a pretty solid win in Florida, but still loses the popular vote by the margin he did, what would have happened? I still kind of wonder.
Niki, any thoughts here about kind of how serious the conversation is right now about the Electoral College? We have, I think, mentioned the sort of national popular vote movement on this show before, that maybe there's a way to circumvent an amendment and that the states would just kind of all pledge together to do this. But, we don't make predictions on this show, but where do you see this going?
Well, look, I think it's a very serious conversation. I think there is a lot of reassessing of institutions and norms, and especially things that could contribute to a continuing legitimacy crisis. And I think there's some real fears that a disconnect between the Electoral College and the popular vote is contributing to a legitimacy crisis in American government. So I do think that it is a live issue. I think what 1970 reminds us is that constitutional amendments are really, really, really hard to get passed. I mean, Americans supported this constitutional amendment in 1970, 80%. It's about 60% now, so it's still overwhelmingly popular. But in order to get the Electoral College abolished, and this is why the constitutional amendment system is set up the way that it is, you have to get small states to vote against their interests, because you have to get the 2/3 majority in Congress, but you also have to get 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So that means some of those small states have to go that way. So, I think we're going to see a lot of institutional reform in the coming years. Constitutional amendments, we haven't seen one since 1992. Really hard to get past. We'll see what happens.
What was 92? I should know this.
92 was, about Congress not being able to vote itself a pay raise in the same session. It's actually the oldest amendment. It had been proposed back in the 18th century. It just took 200 some odd years to get ratified.
All right. Wow. I didn't know that. Steve, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, no, it's just interesting to me what Niki's saying. It's every time this has been polled to varying degrees, it's been very popular, but that's the nature of our politics. Here we are in 2020 and we still get
Well, there's some nice symmetry there with the popular vote, that maybe sometimes just the raw number of Americans who believe in something don't always get their way. Yes, there we go. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Steve Kornacki, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And you'll be on for our next episode as well. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Jacob is our producer alongside Brittany Brown. You can reach out to us if you have anything to say about the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com or find us on social media @thisdaypod on Twitter and Instagram. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.